Part 1, The Last Morning at the Office. The hardest goodbyes are not the ones you expect. They are the ones that quietly erase the person you thought you would always be. Helen Parker never imagined that the final morning of her career would begin exactly like every other workday. At 5:30 in the morning, the alarm beside her bed chimed softly inside the quiet Connecticut home where she had lived for more than 3 decades. She reached across the empty side of the bed and instinctively whispered, "Good morning," before remembering there was no one there to answer. Her husband, Daniel, had been gone for 5 years, yet old habits had a way of surviving long after the people who created them. She sat on the edge of the bed for several moments, looking toward the bedroom window where the first light of an October sunrise painted the maple trees outside in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. For 35 years she had followed the same routine. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. The local morning news played quietly in the background. She packed the same leather briefcase, checked the weather, locked the front door, and drove 22 miles to the accounting firm where she had spent nearly her entire professional life. Today, every familiar step felt strangely temporary. As she pulled into the company parking lot, she noticed she was one of the first cars to arrive, just as she had been thousands of mornings before. The building looked exactly the same, yet everything about it felt different because she knew she would never walk through those glass doors again as an employee. Several co-workers greeted her warmly, but their smiles carried the gentle sadness reserved for someone reaching the end of a long chapter. Throughout the morning, clients stopped by her office to thank her for years of dependable service. Younger accountants asked last-minute questions, hoping to absorb one final lesson before she left. Her supervisor presented her with a framed photograph of the original staff taken more than 30 years earlier. Helen smiled politely for every conversation, every photograph, and every handshake, yet deep inside she felt something she had never expected. It was not excitement. It was not relief. It was fear. For decades people had introduced her as the accountant who could solve impossible problems. She always knew where she needed to be on Monday morning. She always knew who depended on her. By lunchtime, her office shelves had become almost empty. The family photographs she had kept beside her computer were packed into a small cardboard box. Her favorite coffee mug disappeared into newspaper. Even the small green plant a coworker had given her years earlier found a place beside the framed certificates that suddenly seemed less important than they once had. At 3 o'clock the staff gathered in the conference room for a retirement celebration. There was cake decorated with blue frosting, balloons, laughter, and speeches describing Helen as loyal, patient, and endlessly dependable. Someone joked that the office would probably call her every week asking where important files were hidden. Everyone laughed, including Helen, although she quietly wondered whether anyone would call after the first month. Or the second. Or the first year. When the applause ended, she carried her small box through the front lobby. The receptionist hugged her tightly before saying, "Enjoy the next chapter. You have earned it." Helen thanked her, stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, and slowly turned back toward the building. 35 years had ended with nothing more dramatic than an automatic glass door quietly closing behind her. The drive home felt longer than usual. Without thinking, she almost turned toward the grocery store to buy dinner for Daniel before remembering he no longer waited at home. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the house looked peaceful beneath the afternoon sunlight. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt enormous. Every room seemed quieter than she remembered. She carried the cardboard box inside and placed it on the dining room table. The silence surrounding her was so complete that she could hear the ticking of the old grandfather clock Daniel had restored years earlier. She walked slowly through the living room, running her fingers across family photographs that captured birthdays, graduations, vacations, and holidays. Her children now lived in different states, building families and careers of their own. Daniel was gone. Her career had ended only an hour earlier. For the first time since becoming a widow, Helen wondered whether loneliness could arrive all at once instead of gradually. Hoping to distract herself, she decided to organize the home office she had neglected for years. Most drawers contained old tax records, instruction manuals, warranties, and neatly labeled folders. Daniel had always believed that every important document should have its proper place. Smiling at the familiar habit, Helen opened the bottom drawer of a wooden filing cabinet he had built by hand decades earlier. As she removed several folders, she noticed something unusual. The drawer did not seem as deep as it should have been. Curious, she tapped gently against the back panel. Instead of solid wood, she heard a hollow sound. She looked more closely and discovered a narrow compartment hidden behind a removable panel she had never noticed before. Her heartbeat quickened. Carefully sliding the panel aside, she reached inside and felt a single envelope resting alone in the hidden space. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the handwriting across the front was unmistakable. It belonged to Daniel. Her hands began to tremble as she read 6 carefully written words. Open this only after your first day of retirement. Helen stared at the envelope in complete silence. Daniel had died 5 years earlier. Somehow he had known this exact day would come. Taking a slow breath, she carefully broke the seal. She expected a farewell letter or perhaps one final expression of love. Instead, a small antique brass key slipped gently into her palm. Beneath it rested a single folded sheet of paper. She unfolded it and read only one handwritten sentence before every certainty she had carried into retirement disappeared. If you are holding this key, then your real work is only beginning. Part 2, the storage locker no one mentioned. Helen barely noticed the autumn sunset outside her living room window because her attention never left the small brass key resting in the center of her palm. She turned it over several times beneath the warm light of the table lamp, searching for some clue hidden within its worn surface. There were no initials engraved into the metal, no company logo, and no explanation beyond the single sentence Daniel had left behind. After 35 years of marriage, she believed she had known nearly every habit her husband possessed. He labeled household tools, organized family records, and even left handwritten instructions beside complicated appliances. Daniel had never enjoyed mysteries for the sake of mystery. If he had hidden this key until the day she retired, there had to be a reason. That night Helen hardly slept. Her mind replayed countless conversations she wished she could have one more time. Had Daniel ever mentioned renting a storage unit? Had there been unexplained payments on their bank statements years ago? Had she overlooked something while managing the family finances after his passing? Before sunrise the following morning, she opened her laptop and began reviewing old electronic records she had carefully archived. As an accountant, she trusted documents more than memory. She searched year after year until one entry from nearly 2 decades earlier caught her attention. Every January, a modest annual payment had been made to a storage company located less than 40 miles away. The charge had continued automatically for years before quietly ending shortly after Daniel's death. Her name appeared beside his on the rental agreement. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Legally, the unit had belonged to both of them all along, yet she had never known it existed. After breakfast she placed the key inside her purse, started her car, and drove through the colorful Connecticut countryside beneath a sky filled with drifting gray clouds. The storage facility stood on the edge of a small industrial park outside a quiet town she had rarely visited. It was clean, well-maintained, and surprisingly ordinary. Nothing about the place suggested it contained the beginning of the greatest mystery of her life. Inside the office, a friendly manager greeted her with a warm smile. When Helen explained that she believed she had inherited access to an old unit after her husband's passing, the manager searched the archived records. His expression softened almost immediately. "Daniel Parker," he said quietly. "I remember him. He came here every few months for many years. Always polite. Always smiling. He never stayed long." Helen felt a chill. Did he ever mention what he kept here? The manager shook his head. "No, ma'am. But I remember one thing very clearly. He always said the day would come when you would understand why he rented it." Helen could not answer. Her heart was beating too quickly. The manager walked her across several long rows of storage buildings until they stopped before a modest gray door near the end of the property. Unit 214. The brass key fit perfectly into the lock. For a brief moment Helen simply stood there, one hand resting on the handle. Opening the door somehow felt like crossing a line between the life she had known and another life she had never imagined. She slowly lifted the metal door. Instead of dusty furniture or forgotten holiday decorations, she found an immaculate room. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Large plastic containers sat neatly arranged in perfect order. Every box carried a handwritten label in Daniel's careful script. None described objects. Instead, each displayed a single year. 1999. 2000. 2001. 2002. Year after year stretched across nearly 2 decades of their marriage. Helen stepped inside almost afraid to touch anything. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Everything appeared carefully preserved, as though Daniel had expected someone to open it exactly as she was doing now. She lifted the lid from the earliest container. Inside were dozens of handwritten journals, carefully dated notebooks, folded maps of Connecticut covered with pencil markings, faded photographs, newspaper clippings, greeting cards, handwritten letters, and manila folders containing names she did not recognize. Nothing suggested hidden wealth or family scandal. Instead, everything seemed to document ordinary people living ordinary lives. She opened one journal at random. The first page contained a date followed by a simple sentence. Today I met someone who reminded me that quiet kindness often changes history without anyone noticing. The next pages described a family struggling after unexpected medical bills, a retired teacher helping neighborhood children learn to read, and a mechanic repairing cars without charging elderly customers who could no longer afford transportation. Every story ended the same way. Daniel never placed himself at the center. He only recorded what others had done for one another. Helen continued opening box after box. The years unfolded like chapters of a hidden book she had never known her husband had been writing. Thousands of photographs showed community gardens, church suppers, volunteer projects, repaired homes after storms, scholarship ceremonies, neighborhood cleanups, libraries, food pantries, veterans events, and smiling families standing in front of houses she had never seen. Daniel appeared in only a handful of the pictures, usually standing quietly near the edge of the group, almost impossible to notice unless someone deliberately searched for him. It was as though he wanted every memory to belong to someone else. Several hours passed before Helen reached the final container resting alone on the highest shelf. Unlike the others, it contained only one thick leather binder tied with a blue ribbon. Resting on top was another envelope addressed in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Her hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the note. "If you have come this far," it read, "then you have already discovered that I did not spend my life collecting things. I spent my life collecting people whose kindness deserved to be remembered. Now it is your turn to meet them. Start with the first name on the list. Do not read ahead. Every story will prepare you for the next one. By the time you reach the final name, you will finally understand why I wanted you to retire before opening this door." Beneath the letter rested a single sheet of paper listing 12 names and 12 addresses scattered across Connecticut. At the very bottom, written smaller than everything else, was one final sentence that caused Helen to stop breathing for a moment. "The first person has been waiting for you much longer than you realize." Part 3, The First Stranger. The following morning, Helen Parker woke before sunrise with the folded list resting on her bedside table, exactly where she had placed it the night before. She stared at the first name for several quiet minutes before finally tracing the address with her finger. It belonged to a small coastal town in southeastern Connecticut, less than an hour from her home. Daniel had written only 2 words beside the name. "Listen first." Those simple words sounded less like instructions and more like a request from someone who still knew exactly how easily Helen's practical mind could rush toward conclusions. After preparing a thermos of coffee, she slipped the list and the first journal into her leather tote bag and began driving beneath a pale October sky. Brilliant orange and crimson leaves drifted across the highway as the morning sunlight slowly warmed the countryside. During the drive she wondered how many times Daniel had traveled this same road while she assumed he had been attending conferences, meeting clients, or volunteering at church. Instead of feeling betrayed, she found herself becoming increasingly curious. Every mile seemed to carry her farther away from the retirement she had imagined and closer to a life she had never known existed. The address led her to a modest white Cape Cod home overlooking a quiet harbor where fishing boats rocked gently against weathered wooden docks. Flower boxes still decorated the front porch despite the cool weather, and an American flag moved softly in the autumn breeze. The house looked ordinary in every possible way. Helen almost wondered whether she had copied the address incorrectly. She stepped onto the porch and hesitated before ringing the bell. Within moments, slow footsteps approached from inside. The door opened to reveal an elderly white woman, perhaps in her late 70s, with neatly arranged silver hair, kind blue eyes, and a cream-colored cardigan draped over her shoulders. For several seconds neither woman spoke. Then Helen carefully removed the small photograph of Daniel from her purse. The elderly woman's eyes widened immediately. One hand flew gently to her mouth as tears began forming almost instantly. "You must be Helen," she whispered. Helen stood completely still. "How do you know my name?" The woman smiled through her tears. "Because Daniel told me that one day, after you retired, you might come looking for answers." Helen felt the same chill she had experienced inside the storage unit. It was becoming impossible to dismiss these moments as coincidence. The woman invited her inside, where sunlight poured through lace curtains onto shelves filled with family photographs, handmade quilts, and books worn from years of reading. The home radiated warmth, as though generations of memories had quietly settled into every room. They sat together at a round oak kitchen table while fresh cinnamon tea filled the air with a comforting fragrance. Before Helen could ask her first question, the woman stood and carefully retrieved a small wooden box from a nearby cabinet. Inside rested dozens of neatly tied letters, holiday cards, graduation announcements, children's drawings, and photographs spanning more than 20 years. Every bundle bore Daniel's familiar handwriting. Helen carefully lifted one photograph. It showed two smiling children standing proudly beside brand-new bicycles on Christmas morning. Daniel stood several feet away in the background, almost hidden behind a maple tree, smiling quietly while looking toward the family instead of the camera. "He asked never to be the center of any picture," the woman explained gently. "He always said the story belonged to the people whose lives were changing, not to the person helping." Helen looked at another photograph showing a young woman accepting a college diploma. Another showed a repaired front porch after a severe coastal storm. Another captured a family reunion beneath colorful autumn trees. Daniel appeared only occasionally, always standing quietly near the edge, almost invisible unless someone deliberately searched for him. "Who are all these people?" Helen finally asked. The elderly woman folded her hands together before answering. "My family. My children. My grandchildren. And many of the neighbors who became family over the years." Helen frowned gently. "Daniel never told me about any of this." The woman nodded with complete understanding. "No. He promised he never would." She opened one of the bundles and handed Helen a yellowed envelope. The letter inside had been written more than 20 years earlier by the woman's late husband after surviving a difficult period that had nearly cost him both his health and his livelihood. Instead of describing money or dramatic rescue, the letter spoke about something much simpler. Daniel had quietly connected him with skilled neighbors, local churches, retired teachers, carpenters, accountants, and small business owners willing to help without expecting recognition. One act of kindness led to another until an entire community had slowly rebuilt what one struggling family could never have restored alone. "Your husband never believed that solving problems meant doing everything himself," the elderly woman said softly. "He believed the greatest gift was introducing good people to one another." Helen sat silently, overwhelmed by how different this hidden life was from anything she had imagined. Daniel had not secretly carried the weight of dozens of families alone. He had quietly built bridges between ordinary people who wanted to help but never knew where they were needed. As the afternoon continued, more neighbors unexpectedly stopped by after hearing Helen had arrived. One man remembered Daniel helping organize volunteers after a severe winter storm. A retired nurse described how Daniel quietly delivered groceries to homebound seniors while making sure every delivery appeared to come from different neighbors so no one would feel embarrassed. A young father, now middle-aged himself, recalled receiving encouragement from Daniel during one difficult season that inspired him to mentor teenagers years later. Story after story formed a chain stretching across decades, each act of kindness inspiring another. Before Helen prepared to leave, the elderly woman walked her to a bookshelf and carefully removed an old leather-bound guest book. Inside were hundreds of signatures from families Daniel had introduced to community projects throughout Connecticut. Near the final pages rested a folded note addressed in Daniel's handwriting. Helen's heart began racing once again. She unfolded the paper carefully. If Margaret has shared these memories with you, Daniel had written, then you have discovered only the smallest part of what kindness can become when people stop asking who deserves help and start asking who needs hope. The next person on your list will tell you something even I never fully understood until it changed my own life forever. Beneath the message, another sentence had been added in noticeably different handwriting. It belonged to Margaret. When you meet the second name, do not tell them why you have come. Let them recognize you first. Only then will you understand why Daniel always said your story had quietly begun long before you ever noticed it. Part 4, The Promise They Made Together. Helen left Margaret's home carrying far more than another handwritten note. As the quiet fishing town disappeared in her rearview mirror, she found herself replaying every story she had heard that afternoon. Daniel had never been trying to become someone extraordinary. Instead, he had quietly helped ordinary people discover one another. The realization filled her with equal parts admiration and regret. For years she had believed she knew every meaningful chapter of her husband's life, yet an entire collection of beautiful memories had existed just beyond the edges of her own awareness. When she arrived home that evening, she carefully placed Margaret's wooden box beside the journals from the storage unit. Before opening the next address on the list, she unfolded the second letter Daniel had left inside the leather binder. Unlike the first note, this one began with a single sentence that immediately caught her attention. There is one promise you helped me make, even though you have never remembered making it yourself. Helen frowned as she continued reading. Daniel wrote that nearly 28 years earlier they had attended the dedication ceremony for a newly expanded children's reading room inside a small Connecticut public library. At the time, their daughter had been preparing for college while their son was beginning high school. Life had been busy, and the afternoon had seemed completely ordinary. Daniel described how, before the ceremony began, Helen had quietly noticed a nervous little girl standing alone near the entrance holding a worn paperback book together with her library card. Without hesitation, Helen had walked over, knelt beside the child, and spent several minutes talking with her about her favorite stories. When the girl's embarrassed mother apologized because they could not afford to purchase many books, Helen had smiled warmly and said something she never remembered saying. Sometimes all a child needs is one person who believes tomorrow can be better than today. Daniel admitted in the letter that those simple words had stayed with him long after the event ended. He confessed that while Helen had forgotten the conversation by the following week, he had carried it for the rest of his life. Several months later, he unexpectedly met the same family again during a volunteer event. Remembering Helen's kindness, he quietly introduced them to a retired teacher, a local scholarship committee, and several neighbors willing to mentor the young girl. That single introduction slowly grew into a network of support that eventually helped not only one child but dozens of other families connected through schools, libraries, churches, and community organizations. You always believed kindness disappeared after the moment passed, Daniel wrote. I learned that kindness often keeps traveling long after the person who offered it has forgotten it ever happened. Helen lowered the letter, her eyes filling with tears. She searched her memory, trying desperately to picture the library, the little girl, even the conversation itself. Nothing came back clearly. She could remember attending library events with the children, but that afternoon had blended into hundreds of similar family outings over the years. Yet Daniel had remembered every detail. He had built part of his life's purpose around a sentence Helen herself no longer recalled speaking. At the bottom of the letter, Daniel included the second address together with one final instruction. Tomorrow you will meet someone whose entire future changed because of that conversation. Do not introduce yourself. Simply ask them what they remember about a woman who believed tomorrow could always become better than today. Helen folded the letter carefully and looked once more at the second name on the list. Beside it, in Daniel's familiar handwriting, were 4 words that instantly quickened her heartbeat. She still has the book. Part 5, The Town That Remembered Him. The next morning Helen Parker left home carrying the second letter, Daniel's journals, and a quiet determination that had grown stronger with every answer she uncovered. The address led her inland through winding Connecticut back roads lined with old stone walls, maple trees glowing with brilliant autumn color, and small towns where church steeples still marked the center of community life. Unlike her first visit, she no longer expected dramatic revelations. She simply wanted to understand how one ordinary man could leave behind so many extraordinary memories without ever speaking about them. As she entered the town square, she immediately noticed something unusual. Nearly every storefront displayed a small wooden carving of an open lantern in the front window. Some were polished and new while others showed decades of wear. Curious, Helen stepped into a family-owned bakery where the smell of fresh bread filled the warm room. While paying for a cup of coffee, her eyes drifted toward one of the lantern carvings sitting beside the register. "That is beautiful," she said. "Does it have some special meaning here?" The elderly baker smiled gently. "It reminds us that one small light can help someone else find the way home." Helen felt her heart begin to race. She quietly removed Daniel's photograph from her purse. Before she could ask a single question, the baker's expression softened with immediate recognition. He did not call Daniel by name. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "The lantern keeper." Helen looked confused. "The lantern keeper?" The baker nodded. "That is what everyone called him. Not because he carried lanterns, but because he always seemed to appear whenever someone had lost hope. He never wanted recognition, so eventually we stopped using his real name. It became our way of protecting his privacy." Within minutes several customers overheard the conversation and quietly gathered nearby. None of them seemed surprised that Helen had arrived. Instead, each person began sharing memories that sounded remarkably similar despite coming from completely different lives. One woman remembered how the lantern keeper had introduced her struggling husband to a retired carpenter who eventually became both mentor and lifelong friend. A former high school principal recalled anonymous scholarship donations that always arrived just before students considered abandoning college because of financial hardship. A volunteer firefighter described receiving unexpected equipment after a devastating warehouse fire, never learning who had organized the donations until years later. Every story followed the same pattern. Daniel had never solved problems by himself. He simply connected people who possessed generosity with people quietly carrying burdens. Helen realized something even more remarkable. Very few people actually knew one another before Daniel introduced them. Entire friendships, businesses, volunteer organizations, and community traditions had grown from introductions that seemed almost insignificant at the time. As the afternoon continued, the bakery owner invited Helen to visit the Old Town Library across the street. Inside, she found a display case filled with photographs documenting community history stretching back more than 40 years. School fundraisers, library renovations, neighborhood cleanups, scholarship ceremonies, holiday food drives, and rebuilding projects after severe storms filled dozens of albums. Daniel appeared in almost none of the photographs. Yet nearly every event somehow traced back to one quiet conversation he had started years earlier. The librarian noticed Helen studying the display. "He always stood behind the camera," she explained with a smile. "He believed people remembered kindness longer when they remembered each other instead of the person who organized everything." Helen slowly walked through the exhibit until one photograph stopped her completely. It showed the library reading room described in Daniel's second letter nearly 3 decades earlier. Children sat cross-legged listening to a storyteller while parents smiled nearby. Near the back of the room stood a younger Helen, laughing warmly beside a little girl holding a worn paperback novel tightly against her chest. Helen stared at the photograph in disbelief. The memories she had struggled to recover suddenly became clearer. She remembered kneeling beside the shy child. She remembered complimenting the girl's love of reading. Most importantly, she finally remembered saying, "Tomorrow can become better than today if someone believes in you today." Tears quietly filled her eyes. She had forgotten the moment almost immediately after it happened. Daniel never had. The librarian gently handed her a carefully preserved guest ledger from the same event. Inside, tucked between 2 pages, rested a handwritten note dated only 1 week after the library dedication. It was written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Today I finally understood that hope grows fastest when ordinary people believe one small conversation is worth having. Helen gave away those words in 5 minutes. I think I will spend the rest of my life helping them travel farther than either of us can imagine. As Helen carefully folded the note, the librarian smiled knowingly before leading her toward a quiet office at the rear of the building. Sitting on the desk was a carefully wrapped package with Helen's name written across the top in elegant handwriting she had never seen before. Someone asked us to keep this until the day you arrived, the librarian said softly. She has been waiting almost 28 years to thank you both in person. Part 6, the project he saved for her. Helen carried the carefully wrapped package to a quiet reading table near the back of the library. For several moments she simply looked at her name written across the brown paper, wondering how something prepared nearly 3 decades earlier could possibly have survived untouched until this exact day. The librarian respectfully stepped away, leaving her alone with the package. Helen untied the faded blue ribbon and slowly unfolded the paper. Inside rested a beautifully preserved hardcover journal bound in dark green leather, along with several rolled architectural drawings secured by a simple cotton cord. The first page of the journal immediately caught her breath. Written in Daniel's familiar handwriting were the words, "For Helen. Open only after you have discovered why hope always travels farther when 2 people carry it together." Her hands trembled as she turned the page. Instead of personal reflections, she found detailed sketches, budgets, meeting notes, newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten interviews, and carefully organized plans stretching across nearly 20 years. At the top of the second page Daniel had written a title that made Helen stop breathing for an instant. The Second Season Community House. Beneath it he had added another sentence. Our retirement was never meant to be an ending. It was always meant to become our greatest beginning. Helen stared at the words, unable to move. Every page revealed a dream Daniel had quietly built without ever allowing it to become reality during his lifetime. The community house was designed to transform an abandoned textile mill on the edge of a small Connecticut town into a welcoming place where retired teachers could tutor children after school, former accountants could provide free financial guidance to struggling families, retired nurses could organize wellness clinics, skilled carpenters could teach practical workshops, veterans could mentor young adults, and grandparents whose own families lived far away could volunteer to read with children. Every afternoon. Daniel had not imagined a charity. He had envisioned a place where experience itself became the greatest gift retired people could offer. Helen slowly unrolled the architectural drawings across the library table. Sunlight from the tall windows illuminated beautifully detailed floor plans showing reading rooms, classrooms, woodworking spaces, community kitchens, gardens, music rooms, and large gathering halls filled with natural light. Every room had handwritten notes. In the margins. Helen's reading corner. Her favorite window for morning coffee. Place rocking chairs here. She will want flowers outside every entrance. As tears rolled quietly down her cheeks, Helen realized something extraordinary. Daniel had not been designing the building for himself. He had been designing it for the life he believed they would build together after retirement. The following pages contained dozens of lists titled, Things Helen Always Says. One read, Everyone deserves one person who listens without rushing. Another read, Retirement should never mean becoming unnecessary. Another simply said, She believes communities grow stronger one conversation at a time. Helen covered her mouth with both hands. She had spoken those words casually over decades of marriage without ever imagining Daniel had been quietly writing them down. Near the middle of the journal she discovered meeting notes signed by architects, librarians, business owners, church leaders, school principals, and local volunteers. Everyone had agreed to help once Daniel and Helen officially retired. Daniel had coordinated grants, anonymous donations, volunteer commitments, and renovation estimates while carefully keeping the project hidden because he wanted to surprise Helen on the morning after her final day at the office. Then came a page dated only 6 months before his unexpected passing. The handwriting grew noticeably slower. The doctors are encouraging optimism, but I must prepare in case I cannot finish this journey beside her. If that happens, the journals will become my final invitation. She has spent 35 years helping companies balance numbers. Now I hope she will spend the rest of her life helping communities balance hope. Helen could no longer stop crying. Every assumption she had carried about retirement had quietly dissolved. She had believed she and Daniel were planning peaceful mornings, vacations, and slower days together. Daniel had imagined all those things too, but only after they had first built something lasting for everyone else. Just as Helen reached the final pages, a folded blueprint slipped gently onto the table. Across the top, written in bold letters, were the words, "Final approval pending." Attached was a yellow envelope she had not noticed before. Inside rested a single brass key together with one short handwritten message. "I never purchased the building because I promised myself we would unlock its front door together. If you are reading this, someone else has been holding the key for you. They have been waiting until you were finally ready to begin." Beneath the note, Daniel had written one final address. It was not another family home, library, or church. It was the address of the abandoned textile mill itself, followed by 7 words that instantly transformed Helen's grief into purpose. "The volunteers are still waiting for you." Part 7, Learning to Begin Again. Helen drove home from the abandoned textile mill with the brass key resting on the passenger seat beside Daniel's journals. Every few miles she glanced toward it, still unable to believe that her late husband had quietly trusted her with a dream that had survived years beyond his own lifetime. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the fear had begun to outweigh the excitement. She had spent 35 years balancing ledgers, preparing financial reports, and helping businesses make careful decisions. She had never organized a community project, restored a historic building, or inspired hundreds of volunteers. Standing alone in her quiet kitchen that evening, she honestly wondered whether Daniel had believed in someone stronger than the woman she saw in the mirror. She almost placed the journals back into the linen closet where everything had begun. Instead, she opened the final notebook once more. Tucked inside the back cover she found a handwritten checklist titled, "Helen's First Week." The first instruction made her smile through her tears. "Do not try to build the dream alone. The entire reason for the project is proving that nobody succeeds alone." The second instruction was even simpler. "Call one person. Then let hope do the traveling." Early the next morning, Helen picked up the telephone and dialed the first number she could think of. It belonged to Linda Morrison, a retired accountant who had worked in the neighboring office for more than 20 years. Helen expected polite hesitation. Instead, Linda interrupted before she could even finish explaining. "Daniel told me about that community house nearly 10 years ago," she laughed warmly. "I have been waiting for your phone call ever since." Helen stared at the receiver in disbelief. Before lunch she contacted 2 former co-workers from the accounting department, an old human resources manager, and a retired facilities supervisor. Every conversation ended the same way. Nobody seemed surprised. Daniel had quietly planted seeds of the project over many years without ever revealing when it would begin. By the end of the afternoon, 8 retirees had agreed to meet for coffee the following Saturday. Helen spent the next several days visiting neighbors she had not spoken with in months. A retired school principal immediately volunteered to organize educational programs. A former electrician offered to inspect the old building without charging a single dollar. An elderly widow who had once managed the town library proposed creating a reading room exactly like the one Daniel had sketched inside the journal. Each conversation left Helen feeling a little less frightened. The project was no longer resting entirely on her shoulders. It was slowly becoming everyone's shared purpose, exactly as Daniel had imagined. Saturday morning arrived with bright autumn sunshine. Helen reserved a private room inside a small family restaurant near the town square, expecting perhaps a dozen people. When she entered carrying Daniel's journals, she stopped in complete astonishment. More than 50 chairs had already been filled. Former co-workers, retired teachers, nurses, mechanics, firefighters, librarians, pastors, business owners, veterans, and neighbors greeted one another like old friends. Some had driven more than 2 hours across Connecticut after receiving a single telephone call. Several people carried folders labeled ideas. Others brought homemade blueprints, volunteer schedules, grant information, gardening plans, donated supplies, and photographs of similar community centers from neighboring states. Helen suddenly realized. Daniel had never been recruiting volunteers for a building. He had been quietly connecting people who shared the same hope. After everyone settled into their seats, Helen placed the brass key in the center of the largest table. She admitted honestly that she did not know how to lead such an ambitious project. The room remained silent for only a moment before the retired school principal smiled gently. "Then you already understand the most important part of leadership," he said. "People follow honesty much longer than confidence." Laughter and warm agreement spread through the room. For the next 3 hours ideas filled whiteboards faster than anyone could write them down. Volunteer committees formed naturally. Construction teams organized themselves. Fundraising groups appeared without being asked. Young professionals offered technology support while retirees volunteered decades of experience. Helen watched complete strangers become partners exactly as Daniel had described throughout his journals. As the meeting finally came to an end, the restaurant owner quietly approached Helen carrying an old wooden box he had kept hidden beneath the front counter. "Daniel asked me to give you this only after your first planning meeting," he explained softly. Inside rested dozens of folded index cards written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Each card contained the name of one person sitting in the room together with a personal note describing a unique talent he believed they would someday contribute to the community house. At the very bottom of the box lay one final envelope addressed simply to Helen. She opened it carefully and found only one sentence. "Now count the people, not the chairs, because today you finally discovered that retirement was never the end of our work, it was the day our real team came together." Part 8, The Legacy That Belonged to Everyone. Months passed with astonishing speed, and Helen often smiled when she realized she had become busier in retirement than she had ever been during 35 years at the accounting firm. Yet the difference was impossible to ignore. Deadlines had once measured quarterly reports and financial statements. Now, they measured the arrival of donated books, the completion of wheelchair ramps, the planting of community gardens, and the first day children would walk through doors that had remained locked for decades. Every morning she unlocked the old textile mill with Daniel's brass key, and every evening she locked it again knowing the building had become a little more alive than it had been the day before. Volunteers filled every corner of the project. Retired carpenters restored original hardwood floors instead of replacing them because they wanted the building to keep its history. Former teachers sorted thousands of donated books into reading rooms designed for every age group. Electricians modernized lighting while preserving the historic architecture. Garden clubs transformed abandoned loading docks into colorful flower beds and vegetable gardens. Teenagers painted murals celebrating community service alongside veterans who quietly shared life lessons while working with them. Helen watched generations that might never have met become genuine friends through ordinary conversations and shared purpose. Before long, local newspapers began noticing the remarkable transformation taking place inside the forgotten mill. The first article carried a simple headline: "Retirees Build More Than a Community Center." Reporters interviewed volunteers expecting stories about construction, fundraising, and renovation. Instead, every interview returned to the same theme. People spoke about finding purpose after believing their most meaningful years had already passed. One retired nurse explained that she finally felt useful again after leaving the hospital. A former mechanic smiled as he described teaching high school students how to repair bicycles for neighborhood children. A widow who had rarely left her home since losing her husband now organized weekly reading circles that attracted dozens of families. The newspaper published another story the following week, then another. Television stations soon arrived with cameras, but Helen gently asked them to focus on the volunteers rather than herself. "This project has never belonged to one person," she explained. "It belongs to every conversation that convinced someone they still had something valuable to give." Her words spread quickly across Connecticut. Letters began arriving from neighboring towns asking how they could create similar centers. Donations appeared from people Helen had never met. Local businesses contributed furniture, building supplies, computers, kitchen equipment, and books. One publishing company donated an entire mobile library. A nearby hospital offered free health education workshops once the building opened. Colleges volunteered student interns eager to learn from experienced retirees. Helen sometimes stood quietly near the entrance watching strangers carry boxes through the doors, realizing that Daniel's dream had already grown far beyond anything written inside his journals. One rainy Thursday afternoon, a television producer requested permission to film inside the nearly completed building. Helen reluctantly agreed after insisting the volunteers remain the focus of the story. During the interview, the reporter asked a question she had secretly feared since the project began. If your husband could stand beside you today, what do you think he would say after seeing everything this community has accomplished? Helen looked around the enormous gathering hall where volunteers laughed while assembling bookshelves, children colored thank you cards, retired teachers planned tutoring schedules, and neighbors shared coffee around long wooden tables. She smiled softly before answering. He would probably ask why everyone stopped working long enough to interview me. The room filled with warm laughter because everyone knew it was true. Daniel had never wanted recognition. His greatest satisfaction had always come from watching other people discover one another. Several weeks later, as opening day approached, Helen finally entered the small office Daniel had designed for her in the original blueprints. Everything had been arranged exactly as he imagined years earlier. Morning sunlight poured through the large east-facing windows. Fresh flowers bloomed outside every entrance just as his handwritten notes had requested. The rocking chairs overlooked the community garden. Shelves already overflowed with journals documenting the building's remarkable transformation. Sitting quietly on her new desk rested a package wrapped in familiar brown paper. No one admitted placing it there. Inside, Helen discovered a leather-bound guest book with hundreds of signatures collected from volunteers during construction. Beneath the final page lay one sealed envelope addressed in handwriting she immediately recognized. Daniel had written it years before. She carefully unfolded the letter and found only a single paragraph. If this room is full of laughter when you read these words, then the building has succeeded before opening its doors. Buildings never change communities. People do. Promise me one last thing, Helen. Never let anyone place my name above the entrance. Instead, leave enough empty space for every person who walks inside to believe this place belongs to them too. Helen looked slowly toward the unfinished stone arch above the main doorway where volunteers had been waiting for weeks to install the permanent dedication plaque. She suddenly understood why Daniel had never included a name on any of the architectural drawings. The greatest legacy he hoped to leave behind was one that everyone else could honestly call their own. Part 9. The best years were never behind her. 1 year after walking out of her office believing the most meaningful chapter of her life had already ended, Helen Parker stood beneath a crisp blue Connecticut autumn sky outside the fully restored second-season community house. The same abandoned textile mill that had once echoed with silence now overflowed with laughter, conversation, music, and possibility. Fresh flowers framed every entrance exactly as Daniel had imagined. Children raced across the front lawn carrying library books while grandparents settled into white rocking chairs beneath colorful maple trees. Volunteers welcomed visitors from neighboring towns hoping to learn how they might create similar centers in their own communities. The building no longer looked like a forgotten factory. It looked like the beating heart of an entire region. Helen paused before unlocking the front doors with Daniel's brass key. A tradition she had quietly kept every morning since opening day. She smiled as she realized the key had become less about opening a building and more about opening opportunities for people who once believed their useful years had passed. Inside the Great Hall, retired teachers were already preparing reading circles for elementary school children. Former engineers mentored teenagers building science projects. Nurses organized wellness screenings. Veterans led leadership workshops for young adults. The community kitchen filled with the aroma of homemade soup prepared by volunteers who believed that no visitor should ever leave hungry. Every room Daniel had carefully sketched decades earlier had become exactly what he had hoped it would be, yet somehow even more alive because thousands of people had added dreams of their own. As the anniversary celebration officially began, local officials thanked Helen for transforming an abandoned landmark into one of Connecticut's most respected community organizations. Newspapers called it a model for retirement with purpose. National magazines published stories about retired professionals discovering meaningful second careers through volunteer service. Universities sent researchers hoping to understand why the project had inspired similar movements across several states. Helen accepted every compliment with quiet gratitude before gently redirecting attention toward the volunteers filling the audience. "Nothing you see here belongs to one person," she said. "Every bookshelf, every classroom, every flower, every conversation exists because ordinary people decided they still had something valuable to offer someone else." Thunderous applause echoed throughout the hall, but Helen's attention drifted toward the back row where dozens of families she had met during her remarkable journey sat together smiling through tears. Margaret, the elderly woman from the first address, waved warmly beside the once shy little girl from the library, now a successful teacher bringing her own students to the reading center every week. Former scholarship recipients, firefighters, librarians, nurses, business owners, and neighbors who had once been complete strangers now gathered like one enormous extended family. Daniel had quietly connected them years earlier. Helen had simply helped them find one another again. After the ceremony, a group of children asked Helen to join them in the reading room named after her. As she entered, one little boy tugged gently on her sleeve before handing her a folded piece of paper. "My grandfather said you should have this," he whispered. Helen unfolded the note and immediately recognized her son's handwriting. "Mom, while cleaning my attic last month I found one final envelope Dad left for me. He asked me not to give it to you until exactly 1 year after the community house opened. We thought today was the right day." Helen looked around the room before carefully opening the envelope. Inside rested a single photograph taken many years earlier without either of them knowing. It showed Helen and Daniel leaving her office on her final day of work. They were laughing together beneath the evening sun, holding hands as they walked toward the parking lot. On the back Daniel had written one final message. "If you are reading this, then you finally know why I was smiling that afternoon. I was never celebrating your retirement. I was celebrating your beginning. You spent 35 years helping businesses succeed. I knew your greatest work would begin only after you believed it was already over. Thank you for saying yes to the dream we started together. Promise me one last thing. Whenever someone tells you their best years are behind them, hand them this key for one day and let them unlock the front door tomorrow morning. They will discover exactly what you discovered. The greatest chapters of life are never measured by age. They begin the moment we decide someone else's future matters as much as our own." Helen gently pressed the photograph against her heart as tears of gratitude filled her eyes. She walked outside once more where hundreds of volunteers, families, children, and neighbors filled the front lawn beneath brilliant autumn leaves. Looking across the joyful crowd, she finally understood the truth Daniel had been trying to leave for her all along. Retirement had never been the closing chapter of her story. It had simply been the page where the most meaningful story finally began. And as another family walked through the front doors together for the very first time, Helen smiled warmly, reached into her pocket, and quietly placed Daniel's brass key into the waiting hand of a newly retired stranger.